I'm sure everyone thinks their hometown is a unique little place. Not saying that you love it, just that you believe there's no other place on Earth quite like it. Maybe that's true. I can't argue. Spent my entire damn life in the same place, so I can't speak of how unique other little towns might be. What I can tell you is that where I come from is unique, and it isn't a good thing. Olympia Springs, Kentucky is one of a kind, in the worst of ways. Back in the late 1800s, pieces of meat began to fall from the sky. It lasted around 5 minutes before it stopped. No one was able to explain where it had come from, but most people didn't care. It was one of those weird little urban legends that get forgotten over time. Not this one. Dug up an old article online about it from some defunct newspaper out of Louisville. I'm not going to print it here word for word. Probably plagiarism or something. Not that it would be the biggest of my troubles. I'll just give you my abbreviated version. On March 3rd, 1876, it rained chunks of meat in Olympia Springs, Kentucky, for a little less than 5 minutes. The witness considered to be the most reliable was a woman identified only as Mrs. Crouch, first name unrecorded. She reported sitting on her porch making soap just before noon when the meat began to fall onto her front lawn. Fearing it to be a sign from God, she waited for the deluge of flesh to stop before traveling to her neighbors to see if it had affected the greater area. As she walked, she could see that the shreds of meat had fallen all over Olympia Springs. Her neighbors wandered through their yard, gazing in fear and wonder at the pieces of viscera and muscle covering the countryside. A handful of citizens cooked and ate the meat in an attempt to identify it. Opinions ranged from beef, deer, lamb, and bear. Without being able to reach a consensus, someone from the town eventually sent a piece of the meat to the Newark Scientific Association. After examination, the association determined the origin of the meat to be one of two things. The first possibility was lung tissue from a horse. The second possibility was lung tissue from a human infant. The source and variety of the meat were never officially determined, and the strange event faded into obscurity. Some theories range from a flock of vultures simultaneously vomiting the meat on the town, or an odd collection of bacteria forming and falling from the skies, resembling chunks of flesh. Meat falling from the sky is strange enough. But who in the absolute hell would believe a wake of vultures coughed up their meal mid-flight? I've looked it up online and found that it is a startle response when threatened by predators. But not when they are already in the sky. Besides, and this is purely anecdotal, Kentucky isn't known for massive groups of vultures. And hunks of bacteria forming in the sky? I'm no scientist, but I call bullshit. Could be wrong, but it just sounds like guesswork. The article makes it sound like it happened once. Nah. That garbage still pours from the sky at irregular intervals to this day. You see, meat still rains from the sky, approximately 3 times a month in my hometown. Only within the town boundaries. No further. Most people have no clue where it comes from, but there are a few that probably do. Me? I wasn't one to be in the know. Still don't have any damn idea where it comes from. But I do think I know, at the very least, why it happens. Everything has to serve a purpose. Even the grisly shit that pelts the ground every few weeks. Sounds like a load of horse shit, huh? Sure, I get it. It's one of those hokey urban legends that gets passed down over the years. It was probably a completely normal but strange event, then boom, Joe Blow told a slightly different version of it, then passed it down from generation to generation with just a few changes here and there, until the story lost its roots. It goes from something ordinary to something out of this world. I've watched it happen my entire life. It became so commonplace, it never occurred to me as a child it didn't happen everywhere. I just accepted it. As I grew older, it became clearer it wasn't the norm. Now, As an adult, my job is to clean it up. The town isn't big, but there are 21 of us on the payroll. We all make a little north of $60,000 a year, which is a jackpot in a rural area like this. They call us the city work crew, but you won't see us out very often. Everyone in town knows we're the guys that clean up that godforsaken mess. We're kind of urban legends ourselves. No one else in town is allowed out while the meat falls, except us. You're probably asking yourself why no one in Olympia Springs has tried to figure out why it rains flesh or where it comes from. It's an honest enough concern, but all I can tell you is people do wonder. It's a constant topic of hushed conversation around town, but no one wants to ask questions too loudly. Parishioners at the Olympia Springs Primitive Church can get hostile pretty quickly if they overhear people discussing it. Reverend Packard and his zealots have been known to make late-night visits to the homes of those who ask too many questions. "Best to keep your mouth shut," Old Tom, the owner of the Wicked Eye Saloon, would tell any customer he heard discussing the matter. "Got some of the primitives in here tonight. Mind what you say." My job used to seem pretty cushy. You're only scheduled to work one 8-hour shift every week. The only duty during that time is to sit on the back stoop of the town hall annex and watch the skies for signs of falling meat. Odds are it's going to hit on some other poor bastard's shift, but now and again you're the one who gets to sound the alarm. When the downpour gets going, it's all hands on deck. All 21 of us report for cleanup duty immediately. It doesn't fall at fixed times either. Like I've said, about 3 times a month, but even that can change. Could be twice, could be 5 times. Day or night, 2 feet of snow or a mid-August drought. It doesn't matter. If it starts on your shift, there is a paint-chipped red button, Old Red, fixed to the brick wall of the annex. As soon as the meat starts to fall, you punch it. Sirens that take your mind to World War II air raid warnings burst across the town. When the siren is on, every citizen in town knows to head indoors immediately. No questions asked. You just drop your shit and get moving. If you're taking a stroll through a neighborhood far from home when the alarm sounds, you walk to the first available home, knock on the door, and the owner is going to let you inside. Been that way since I was a kid. Longer than that, I'm sure. It happened to me a lot as a kid. Most parents would tell their children to play close to the house, but what kid listens to that? I'd be halfway across town playing with the Denton brothers most of the time when the alarms went off. It was a hell of a lot more fun to take cover with some kids your age rather than sitting around in your room all by yourself. Once you're safely inside, you shut the blinds and stay inside until the siren cuts off. The city work crew handles that too. After our crew scours the town looking for the pulpy shreds and takes them to the church, we hit that good old red button again and the wailing ceases. You're free to head outside until we sound the alarm again. While we're on cleanup duty, we have to wear the most uncomfortable get-up I've ever had the displeasure of putting on. Rubber fishing waders with attached boots, knee-length raincoat, fisherman's hat, goggles, and a respirator. It's like your own personal sauna with no off switch. If you've ever watched The Deadliest Catch, you'll get a pretty good feel for the uniform. Looks like we're about to toss crab traps in the Bering Sea. We haul around wheelbarrows and use trash picker sticks to collect the fleshy bits across the town. It feels like you're making a demonic kebab when you've gathered up a dozen chunks of the shit. Once your trash spike is covered in the slimy mess, you press them off into the wheelbarrow. When they get topped off, you'll head up the main drags and dump the loads into Rubbermaid totes in the back of a city work truck. By the time we've collected it all, it fills up 21 of those Rubbermaid totes exactly. That's about the best metric we figured out for determining if we found it all. Some of the crews in the old days tried counting the pieces. A few other crews tried to calculate the average weight. It never really seemed to be the same. But the volume of 21 of those red storage crates seemed to do the trick. After a thorough sweep of the town, we haul the greasy tubs to the back of the Olympia Springs Primitive Church. Reverend Packard will be standing out back next to the old coal chute and watching as we dump all 21 loads of meat into the inky darkness. He never wore the same safety equipment we did, though. Just held an umbrella over his head, which was a little funny to watch since all of the meat had finished falling, or we wouldn't even be there. But damn, Packard was a weird guy. I'd never seen him do anything out of the way, nothing bad. He just gave me the creeps. Always had this big, weird grin on his face while he would watch us dump the tubs down the old chute. Sometimes he would be whistling some tuneless little ditty. It just seemed like he enjoyed those days. What he did with the meat bothered me too. He told us there was an old furnace down there that he used to burn up the piles of disgusting viscera, but the explanation never sat well with me. When we rolled the totes to him and he opened the chute, the pissy smell of ammonia and the coppery tang of blood would hit you in the face like a sack of bricks. It smelled like 100 years worth of rot was pouring out of the hole. Even when the heavy steel doors were closed, the reek would still drift out. It smelled like he was just storing the stuff down there. I knew he couldn't be. It would be flowing out of the coal chute and into the sanctuary if he was. But I'll be damned if it didn't smell like every bit of it was just sitting down there rotting on the cellar floor. I had done the job for over 15 years with no complaints. My time was largely my own, and the fellows I worked with were good company. One or two of them would usually pop in at the annex and keep me company on the porch. Good fellows to work with. Everything was smooth sailing until Thomas Jordan on our crew screwed the pooch. The dumb bastard broke the cardinal rule and swallowed some of that ungodly shit. The day it happened, I was on watch behind the annex. Thumbing through an old paperback ate up most of my days on duty, but that day the old Agatha Christie book couldn't hook my attention. My eyes were getting heavy, and I was about to drift off into a mid-afternoon nap when I heard a wet plop on the metal roof above me. Most of the guys hated it when the rain started on their shift. The sirens were the loudest outside the annex, but I didn't mind. I kept a pair of earplugs in my pocket, and always enjoyed the fact I didn't have to haul my ass from my house to work. A red piece of gristle slid down onto the concrete in front of me, and I reached over my shoulder and slapped Old Red. As the sirens blasted to life, I tossed the paper back into the chair and headed inside to gear up. My walkie chattered as the other crewmen signaled their acknowledgement, and I popped in my earplugs to block out the wailing klaxon. Within 2 minutes of the siren, all 21 men on the crew signaled they were in action and collecting the falling meat. Some of them kept work trucks at their houses, which was handy since it allowed us to cover a greater area with less downtime. I had looked at the sky that day and could see the characteristic scarlet hue that appeared when the rain started. It never overpowered the blue of the sky, but the sickening shade always made itself known. Something about the red tinge to the sky that day looked a little different. It was darker. Not the usual lighter tone of red. I didn't think much of it at the time, but maybe I should have. Not one to believe in signs, but seems like that could have been one. The deluge lasted longer than usual that day. 7 minutes since the start, and fat globs of flesh were still pelting off my gear and onto the ground. It was never an overwhelming amount, but longer periods of downfall equaled a longer clean. It never caused a greater quantity of meat to fall, but the pieces seemed smaller, which made it take about twice the time to clean it up. Once the greasy chunks stopped falling and I cleaned up my section of town, I dumped the rest of my load into the red tote in the back of the truck and secured the plastic lid before sliding into the cab. I always cranked up the AC as high as it would go, summer or winter. The rain gear didn't allow much airflow, and I was always a dripping mess by the time I wrapped up a shift. I tossed the truck into drive and headed toward the church, dreading seeing the weird old man standing beside the chute. When I pulled up, I saw Packard standing beside the opening. He was smiling and holding a neon yellow umbrella over his head. Greasy streaks of red and brown liquid ran down the sides, and I knew he had stood outside during the downfall. absolutely against the town rules, but I'm not sure who would even tell him he needed to go inside. It wasn't as if anyone else was lining up to dispose of the totes. The comical sight of the old pastor would have made me laugh if he didn't make me so damned uncomfortable. I slid out of the cab and avoided making eye contact with him as I slid the tote into the wheelbarrow. My eyes stayed fixed on the ground ahead of me as I approached. "Ahoy there, Jacob," Reverend Packard shouted as I rolled my solitary load toward the coal chute. He wore a smooth black suit with a priest's collar, which puzzled me. His house of worship, Olympia Springs Primitive Church, was non-denominational. I'm no theologian, but I was pretty sure only Catholics and maybe Presbyterians wore those collars. The downpour of muscle and tissue had stopped long ago, but still he held his yellow umbrella overhead. "Was it a hard day, young man? The rain seemed to last a good bit longer than usual. It's been many a year since I've seen it do such a thing." I just nodded at the old man in response as I moved beside him and lined up the end of the wheelbarrow with the opening. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him staring at me. His televangelist grin and perky demeanor during these days always put me on edge. Packard was the only person in town who seemed to find any joy in these events. The front tire of my wheelbarrow bumped against the edge of the chute, and I let go of the handles, setting the legs onto the damp earth. I edged between Packard and the chute, doing my best not to touch him, as I tipped the tote's slick load of flesh into the blackness below. Sickening splatters echoed up from the church basement, accompanied by the aroma of piss and blood. The last few shreds of flesh and sinew fell from the edge of the red tote into the darkness below. More than once, whatever I'd eaten for breakfast would pour out of me and follow the load into the hole. If I was fast enough to pull my mask away from my mouth, that was. My stomach churned, as it always had, but luckily I managed to keep my meal down. Even through the respirator, the stench made my eyes water. I tried not to let my mind linger too long on the fact that Packard stood just feet away, smiling as the foul stench floated through the hot afternoon air. "The rain lasted longer than usual today," Packard said again, the glee in his voice piercing my ears like nails on a chalkboard. Whenever you ignored the old man, he would push whatever topic he wanted to discuss. "Wonder what that's about." Kinda weird to me that you only wonder why it lasted longer, instead of why this shit happens at all. I grunted as I turned to face the old man. Something about his aura sent me beyond my tipping point that day, and I couldn't keep my mouth shut. "Why in the hell is this such a fun day for you, old man? You're always out here grinning like something good happened. Meat is falling from the sky and it ain't normal. Maybe you shouldn't be so damn thrilled." "You ought to be grateful," he said, the unsettling grin still stretching across his face. Shifting the umbrella in his grip, he gestured to the town around us with his free hand. I turned around and began walking towards my truck when he started again. "Keeps you employed and keeps Olympia Springs safe. You truly are doing important work, Jacob. I do hope you know that." I paused and turned around to look at the gleeful preacher. "What the hell do you mean it keeps us safe?" I asked, already walking towards the man with my fists clenched. "You know what this is?" The smile melted away from Packard's wrinkled face. His brows furrowed, and he looked up towards the sky. The streaks of red had faded away long ago. His arms stretched out, palms turned upward. His umbrella toppled from his hand onto the ground. That Cheshire smile slid back across his lips. "No," he muttered. "Just a labor God set before us. Job toiled in his fields to glorify the Lord, and we shall do the same. We gather the downfall as the Israelites gathered manna in the desert." "The Israelites ate the manna," I said with a sneer. "We burn this shit." No reply. Packard just kept his arms outstretched and looked into the sky. Later that night, I was sitting in my recliner, working my way through a six-pack when my cell phone rang. Looking at the screen, I saw Thomas's face smiling stupidly at me. As the newest man on the crew, he tended to call a lot. Always had questions about the job. I slid my thumb across the screen to answer and put the phone to my ear. "Didn't see you today, Tommy boy," I said without a greeting. "I left pretty quick after I dropped off my totes," he responded. His voice sounded strange. Oddly thick, like he had a mouth full of peanut butter. "I'm not feeling too well, if I'm honest. Laid up in bed since I got home earlier." "What's got you under the weather?" I asked as I set my beer down on the table and dropped the leg rest of my recliner. "If you got a stomach bug or something, just let me know. I'll need to let the rest of the crew know to be expecting some extra work if it rains again, before you're on the mend." The lion remained silent. "Tom?" I questioned. "You there, bud? It's not a big deal if you need to take a few sick days. I'll pick up your lookout shift at the annex this week." "Jake, I screwed up," he finally responded. "I know I gotta tell someone, but shit, I don't know. I'm scared." "Just tell me what happened, Thomas," I replied, concern mounting. "Whatever the problem is, we'll get it sorted out." "Got some of the meat in my mouth today at work," Thomas replied, his voice seeming thicker than it had when I first answered the call. "My stomach's been in knots ever since. Been stuck on the toilet. It's coming out both ends, man. I'm scared." I furrowed my brow in confusion. How the hell had he gotten some of that garbage in his mouth? "Were you wearing your gear?" I asked. "You didn't take it off while you were working, did you?" Silence again. "Thomas, were you wearing your damn mask or not?" I barked. "Don't tell me you took it off. We've been over this shit a million times. Safety gear is mandatory." "It's hot, Jacob," he garbled weakly. I heard him pull the phone away from his face, and the sound of vomit splashing in the toilet filled the silence. "I just pulled my respirator down for a second to catch my breath, and a piece of it fell in my mouth. I spit it out, but I'm pretty sure I swallowed some of the blood on it. Kept spitting, but that nasty taste wouldn't go away. It's still lingering now, even through all the puking." "You dressed?" I asked as I jumped from the recliner and started pulling on my boots. "I'm coming over to take you to see the doc." "Yeah, I'm still dressed," he said. I could hear thick, mucusy rasps as he spoke. "Thanks, Jake." There wasn't much traffic on the main road as I peeled through town toward Thomas's house. I blew through stop signs and 2 traffic signals. I thought about slowing down for a moment, fearing a speeding ticket, but my concerns melted away pretty quickly. The city work crew wasn't exactly beyond the law, but the local deputies were pretty happy to let us go for traffic offenses. No one wanted to be the son of a bitch who kept one of the crew from getting to the job. Most of us had been doing the cleanup job for years, but Thomas was just a kid. Old-timers took it upon themselves to show the newcomers to the crew all the ins and outs of the job. Thomas had been my unofficial apprentice, and I had taken this training seriously. We had all warned him not to take chances with this stuff, but it seemed like nothing I had told him sank in. Less than 20 minutes after hanging up the phone, I had parked my truck haphazardly in Thomas's driveway and bounded to the porch. I pounded against the door and called his name for what felt like an hour, but received no response. My heart was slamming against my chest as I waited for an answer. No one that I knew of had ever gotten any of the meat in their mouth, and I was worried what it could do to him. I slammed my fist on the door a few more times, but he still didn't answer. Pressing my ear against the door, I could hear a faint voice, but couldn't make out the words. My panic had risen to a point I couldn't handle. I began to kick the door. The cheap wooden door began to crack and splinter, but it remained tightly in the frame. Realizing I was making no real progress, I ran back to my truck and pulled a pry bar from the toolbox. It only took a few tries before a final crackling of wood sounded and the door flew inward. In front of me, sprawled on the living room floor, was Thomas. or what I thought was Thomas. He had always been a beanpole of a kid, but not anymore. The same wretched smell from the church coal chute filled my nose as I walked toward the fleshy pile in the center of the living room rug. An almost human-like figure squirmed lazily in place. Folds of fatty flesh spilled out from a shirt. His jeans were bursting at the seams. All of his fingers and toes were swollen like cooked sausage, protruding from bloated stubs that no longer resembled arms or legs. Blood and bile pooled around him as his flesh rippled and pulsed. I turned my head, trying to suck in breaths of fresh air from the open door, but gagged as the fetid air filled my lungs. I retched, covering my mouth with the collar of my shirt. "Tom?" I muttered in a weak voice, trying not to gag. "Thomas? Can you hear me?" The thing replied with a wet, wheezing effort. "Please. Bloody saliva bubbled from a fatty fold where his face should have been. His words came out in wet, garbled bursts. The repulsive appendages twitched as the mound of flesh attempted to orient itself toward me. Its efforts were worthless, and a blubbering cry poured from the folds. I began to stumble back as the thick fingers lifted and reached towards me. My stomach began to lurch violently again as I ran outside and vomited off the edge of the porch. After wiping away the wet flecks from my face, I pulled out my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. When the operator answered, I rambled incoherently about Thomas's job on the work crew and his grotesque condition. The woman on the other end of the line tried to calm me down, but it was no use. Eventually, the operator settled for the address and told me an EMT crew would be on their way immediately. I paced the driveway while I waited. Thomas needed help, but I knew there wasn't a damn thing I could do for him. Looking at him made me feel like I was losing my mind. More than once, I had to stop myself from going back in the house. I knew that thing in there had to be Thomas, but nothing from the darkest part of my mind could understand how swallowing any of that hellish meat could have done this to him. When the EMTs arrived, I watched helplessly from the driveway. The two men struggled trying to slide Thomas's massive frame onto the gurney, but his incredible weight was too much for them. One of the men called for a second EMT unit. They both waited on the porch for the additional crew to arrive. "Why the hell are you just standing there?" I shouted from the driveway. "Get the hell in there and help him!" "We've never seen anything like this," one of the men said. "I'm not sure what... Shit. He's gonna have to wait until we get him to the hospital. This is too much for me." Another ambulance came blaring down the road and parked behind the other in the drive. Two more EMTs ran towards the door and vanished inside. I thought for a moment to follow them, but I knew it would be no help. The combined effort of 4 men and 2 gurneys was enough to finally haul him out of the house and load him into the back of an ambulance. A trail of blood and bile trickled behind them as they carried him out. The second EMT team closed up the ambulance and slapped the back door before the sirens boomed to life. Gravel flew into the air as they peeled away from the house. "Where are they taking him?" I asked one of the EMTs. "County General," he responded, visibly shaken. He fumbled a cigarette from a crumpled pack in his jacket pocket. As he held the lighter to his smoke, I recognized him. Dale Tippett. We'd gone to high school together. "The ER is about to have one hell of an experience." "I'll meet you there," I barked and started running towards my truck. "No," Dale responded. "Mayor says for you to go home. Could be another rain." I froze in my tracks. "What the hell do you mean the mayor told me to go home?" I asked, fingers curling into a fist. "I can't leave him alone there." "Any illness of the city cleanup crew is reported to the mayor," he said sternly. "Can't have 2 of you out of the rotation. If it happens again while the 2 of you are out, it could cause issues. You know the rules." "It already fell today," I shouted at the man. "I'm 48 damn years old and never once in my life has that shit happened twice in one day." "Go home, Jake," Dale said as he got into his ambulance. You can't do anything for him. God knows if County General can either. He slammed the door, and the ambulance drove out of sight. Frustrated and scared, I got into my truck and let it idle, as I stared out at the darkening street. I didn't want to leave Thomas alone at the hospital, but I knew Dale was right. What the hell could I have done for him? I couldn't even keep it together enough to stay in the room with him while I waited for help to arrive. Rather than take the direct route home, I decided to take the long way back to clear my head. The country roads and cool evening air would do me some good. Cigarette butts were overflowing from the console ashtray by the time I decided to finally call it a night. Tired and confused, I started heading towards the house. Olympia Springs Primitive Church sat ahead of me. It sat on Route 32, and I passed it every time I drove to town and back. The place sent a shiver down my spine every time I saw it. I'd always imagined Reverend Packard was watching me through a window, a maniacal grin on his face. Usually only Packard's old sedan sat outside the church when there were no services, but I could see the outline of a large vehicle sitting at the rear. As I cruised closer, I could make out the red and white details. It was the ambulance that carried Thomas away, heading for County General. Why the hell was the ambulance sitting outside of the church? The 4 EMTs were hauling Thomas out of the ambulance and carrying him towards the back of the church. A large white sheet was draped over his body, flapping in the night breeze. Packard was standing beside them, guiding their path with a flashlight and patting them on the back as they struggled with the load. They vanished around the corner of the building. Scared I would lose sight of them, I hit the gas and pulled my truck onto Old Henry Road. It was nothing more than 2 gravel ruts, but it ran beside the church so I could keep my eyes on Packard and the EMTs. I turned off my headlights as I rolled onto the gravel, scared they would find me watching them. The men were still struggling to haul Thomas on the stretchers. Packard stood ahead of them, waving his flashlight and gesturing toward the mouth of the open coal chute. As they reached the opening, the 4 men gathered all their strength and tilted Thomas towards the opening, dumping him down into the darkness below the church. I slowly pushed my foot down on the gas pedal and inched my truck down the road, blocking myself from view behind a group of squat trees. My heart was in my throat, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. Those bastards hadn't taken Thomas to the hospital. They tossed him like garbage into that ammonia-reeking hellhole. Once I could see the ambulances vanish in the distance, I put my truck in reverse, backing slowly towards the main road. For a moment I thought about turning on my headlights, but didn't want Packard to see me pull into the parking lot. I figured he had gone inside by then, but I wasn't sure. All the lights were off inside the church, and there was no sign of the Reverend from where I parked. As I slipped from the car and started towards the back of the truck, I froze. What the hell is your plan here, Jacob? I thought to myself. You just gotta burst into the church and haul Thomas out of the cellar? Get a grip, climb back in the truck and get the hell out of here. I wanted to run, to get in my truck and drive home. No one would know I had been there. There was nothing I could do for Thomas anyway. So why get myself mixed up in the middle of whatever the hell was going on in there? But I didn't go home. Thomas was my friend, and I couldn't leave him in that cellar. My keys jingled as I unlocked the chrome cross box in the bed of my truck. I looked around nervously, scared that the Reverend would hear me. But I needed to move quickly. It took me a few minutes of shifting through all the shit inside, but eventually my hand rubbed against the smooth stock of a shotgun. It was wedged tightly in the side, held in place by a carelessly piled stack of tools. I pulled it out and checked the chamber. It was empty, so I started pushing aside wrenches and hammers until I saw what I was looking for. A floppy cardboard box of shells sitting beneath the tape measure. Scooping out a handful, I loaded the shotgun and shoved the extra shells in my pocket. As I approached the front door of the church, the smell of rot and ammonia filled the air. I had never attended a service there, but the stench was the same that came from the coal chute around the back of the building. The stench was enough to make me retch. I gagged silently, trying not to draw attention. The coppery tang of blood was so heavy in the air that I felt like I had a mouthful of pennies. With every step I took towards the door, the stench grew thicker. I pushed the double doors open, and the last moments of sunlight poured into the sanctuary. Shadows danced across the room, making me feel like I was walking into one of those old 1980s haunted house movies. Cobwebs fluttered in the stifling breeze. Dying rays of light filtered through the smudged windows, illuminating the shabby carpet and splintering pews. Dog-eared Bibles flopped over the racks in front of each seat. I had seen people come in and out of here for years, but standing inside, none of it made sense. The place was in shambles. Imagining sitting in there and the wretched smell was beyond my imagination. What kind of people would go there to worship? What would they worship? The boards creaked under my boots as I made my way down the aisle towards the altar. I scanned my head from side to side, keeping my shotgun level, as I searched for another room leading out of the sanctuary. To the left of the pulpit, there was an old wooden door, the only one I could see other than the one I had entered through. I inched towards the door, cold sweat running down the back of my neck. Any moment, I expected Packard to burst out from behind the pulpit and charge me. But as I moved past, my fear was relieved. My clammy hands wrapped tightly around the knob and turned it as slowly as I could. The old metal squealed at just the right pitch that my ears began to ache. If the old man was inside, I didn't know how he wouldn't have heard it. The door pushed in and I leveled my shotgun again, keeping it trained in front of me just in case old Packard decided to make an appearance. I wouldn't go out of my way to shoot him, but if he popped up, well, things happen. My eyes adjusted to the low light as I looked into the room. Only a single dim bulb burned behind a dusty lampshade. A desk sat in the corner piled with papers and a few books. No Bible, though. A strange thing to be missing from the office of a pastor. In the opposite corner from the desk, I could see the iron banister of a spiral staircase. As I approached it, I looked down into the darkness. While I had almost adjusted to the smell in the sanctuary, it was pouring from the dark opening, as though I were standing in a field of rotten meat. My throat quivered as I fought to keep myself from vomiting. Standing at the top of the stairs, I could see dancing flickers of light bouncing off the bottom floor's brick wall. A hot, putrid heat was rolling up toward me, making the aroma from below so much worse. My eyes watered and my stomach was rolling. As quietly as I could, I started to descend the stairs, but the thud of my boots was still unsettlingly loud. I winced with each footfall, expecting someone to call out and see who was coming. If Packard was down there, it was almost impossible the slimy bastard hadn't heard me coming. But still, I had to go. Thomas was down there, dying or dead, and I couldn't leave him behind. The heel of my boot met with the basement floor, and I nearly fell. It was covered in something thick and wet. I caught myself on the wall, but was shocked to feel something hot and pulsing beneath my hand. Red vines clung to the walls between the dim bulbs that flickered erratically on and off. It could have been a trick of the low light, but it looked like pale, rippling moss covered most of the walls between the vines. I walked slowly down the hallway, carefully placing the sole of each boot flat on the ground before taking another step. Whatever was covering the floor was so slippery that I was sure I would fall at any moment. The light grew dimmer the further I went, but I could hear something further ahead. A sing-song voice filled with excitement and adoration. It was Packard. "Eat, yes, that's right. Eat," he said from somewhere up ahead. "Enjoy your offering, masters." There was a wet plop, followed by the scraping of metal on stone. "There will be more soon," Packard crooned. "The rain was long today, and the sky swells with your precious sustenance." The wet sounds of chewing followed.
A special treat for you today, Master,
Packard shouted.
Rare indeed. We haven't had one of these in many years.
I heard Packard grunting and something heavy sliding across the concrete floor. Ahead of me, the hallway made a 90-degree bend, and I was certain that the madman would be just around the corner. My fingers tightened around the shotgun, and I could feel the barrel bob up and down as my arms began to shake. Who the hell was he talking to?
Someone tried to partake in your feast, but no, Reverend Packard has brought him here to pay for his crimes. The heretic shall sustain you all. Feast on his corpulent flesh.
I stopped and peeked around the corner toward the old man's voice. Packard was pulling Thomas's bloated body into the middle of a room, covered in the slimy, pale moss. His massive body only moved a few inches with each of the old man's tugs, but I was shocked at the astounding strength he must have had to move Thomas. He dropped the sagging appendages to the floor and stepped back. The moss began to shiver and shake. Ripples like ocean waves ran across the wall as 3 fissures began to open. For a moment, I feared the basement walls were giving way and considered running for the staircase. Before I could, the fissures opened wider to reveal 2 huge, jagged rows of teeth. A bellowing roar erupted from the openings, and the teeth ground together before springing open. Fat, lazy tongues dropped from inside the huge holes and slithered onto the floor towards my friend. Thin tendrils of flesh at the tip of each tongue circled Thomas's swollen appendages and began to rip him apart. The tongues pulled the pieces back into the holes. The mouths on the wall chewed noisily. Oozing chunks of flesh were thrown into each of the mouths on the walls before the slithering tongues returned for another bite. Thomas had screamed for a moment, but the rapid blood loss had killed him almost instantly. The monstrosities in the wall made quick work of his remains. He was gone before I could take a single step. This is what Packard does with the meat. There had never been a furnace down here. Packard had never destroyed any of it. He was feeding these abominations that terrible gore that fell from the sky. Staring in horror at the massive creatures in the wall, I had finally convinced myself to turn and leave when the old man perked up his head. Reverend Packard turned towards me and smiled. And even the slithering tongues seemed to orient themselves in my direction to acknowledge me. The shotgun in my hands was shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it.
Jacob?
Packard questioned with glee.
What a surprise. But I'm not sure you should be here.
What the hell is this? I barked at him in my best attempt at intimidation. What the hell are you doing?
Completing the disposal process,
Packard said, smiling at me intently. There was a shovel in his left hand, the blade covered in gore. I assumed he had been using it to scoop up the meat to feed those monstrosities.
I think it's time for you to go home, or the mayor is going to have to find a new member for the city work crew.
I don't understand, I muttered, bringing the shotgun up to level with Packard. What are you doing?
You've already asked me that, Jacob. Isn't it obvious? I'm feeding the masters, of course,
he replied, gesturing towards the cavernous mouths in the walls. I could now clearly see that what I had taken for moss was grotesque flesh coating the walls.
Just like you've been doing all these years.
What the hell are they?
They're the first ones,
he said matter-of-factly.
They're first ones to consume the gift all those many years ago. When the rain of flesh first fell, 3 people ate of the gift. This was their blessing. I serve them, and so do you. If we didn't feed them, then they would have to find other ways to satisfy themselves. That may not work out so well for the fine citizens of Olympia Springs.
Packard and I stared at each other for a moment, eyes locked, and his smile began to drift away.
Jacob, I'm going to let you leave now,
he said, lifting his shovel into a defensive position. The three mouths stretched and drooled behind him.
This will be your last chance before I
pulled the trigger, silencing him before he could finish his idle threat. A red spray of blood covered the fleshy wall behind him, sending the flailing tongues into a frenzy. They lapped up the fresh crimson spray and fell to the floor, looking for something else to drag inside. Packard was struggling weakly on the floor, body riddled with buckshot, as the tongues began to wrap around him. He screamed as they pulled him apart. After the tongues had finished devouring Packard, they slithered in my direction. I turned and ran down the hallways, almost sliding and falling on the slick floor. The slithering sound behind me was getting closer as I neared the circular stairs. Looking over my shoulder, I saw that the writhing tongues had stopped at the turn in the corridor. They jutted and strained, but were able to travel no further. I felt a bit of relief as I bounded up the stairs. When I finally reached my old pickup truck, I fumbled in the bed for the 2 cans of gas and pulled them over the side. I walked back into the sanctuary and began to pour the contents of the first containers over the pews. The sounds of guttural screams were pouring through the open office door, and I knew those tongues were still struggling at the corner of the hall, hoping I was stupid enough to go back inside. Making my way outside, I ran to the back and lifted the heavy hatch on the old coal chute. Gasoline sloshed as I tipped the final can into the black hole and dropped the entire container inside. Another shriek erupted from below, and I could hear the wet smack of the tongues slamming against the sides of the chute. They were searching for me, but I was fairly sure they wouldn't be able to reach me from that distance. I pulled a Zippo light from my pocket and rolled the wheel, sending sparks from the flint and igniting the wick. It soared through the darkness as I opened my hand and clacked heavily against the stone floor below. An eruption of fire burst to life, engulfing the entire basement. The tongues spasmed as the flames licked against them. I slammed the steel lid closed and began to walk back to my truck. Before the engine turned over, I could see the bright glow of flames through the stained glass windows. The sanctuary would soon burn, bringing the building collapsing in on itself. I hope that's enough to kill those things. Maybe all this is done. I didn't stick around to watch it burn. I just hauled my ass back to my truck and headed home. The city work crews all received termination letters the following week. I haven't heard from anyone about whether or not they knew who had destroyed the church, but there's a better than bad chance they know it was me. Dale, the EMT who came to get Thomas, had seen me there. No mistaking that. I spent my unemployed months sitting on the porch of my house, reading cheap paperbacks and watching the sky, always expecting the meat to rain down, and worrying what would happen if no one picked it up. But for months, it never fell. I started working for the State Highway Department resurfacing roads not long ago. It's been a bit of an adjustment, going from doing so little work to busting my ass day in and day out. I like it though. As a bonus, I still get to work outside, which I've always enjoyed. Things were looking up. At least for a while. I'm pretty sure some bad shit is brewing. Yesterday, while I was putting up traffic cones at our new work site, a grisly chunk of meat fell from the sky. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. Today's video was supported by patrons like Mark from Earth, Crimson Muse, Joy Burton, Diane Showers, Mark Zwall, Cheryl James, Pick Your Sticker, Teddy Dog, Clue404, Mamakato, Dante Kincaid, Zarin Ray, Angela Donovan, Blarian50, Devin Kyle, Timothy Baird, Ajeti, Bert Turner, Bajani Espinal, Michael Pierce, Big Joe, Gary Harkonnen, LaDonna Spivey, Scott Tanaka, Tom Stewart, Sherman Davis, Bryce Shelton, Susan McClendon, Elise Batiste, Lisa in the Cult Jam, Open Circuit, Fabulavore, Raymond Jaggers, That Darn Fox, Raison Detra, Kai Gaming 99, Wendy Burns, The Wendigo, Michael Squishy Park, The Gemstar, Vault 77 Citizen, Puppy Dan, Clovis Wolf, Eldridge Elm, Derek Prey, Elder Being, KC Hawaii, Rob T, Tragic Mermaid, Darren Fishnaller, Cloves Noah Harris, Roe Underwood, Florida Man Luke, Bethany's Mom, Winter's Kiss, Sam Brooke, The White Stag, Corey Connection, No Name, Marta Cara, Professor Elm, Kathy Barrickman, Cybard Sands, Steve Hennessy, Melanie Sanders and The Archivist, Rob Smith, Term 4, Naz Razio, J. David Wellman Jr., Parker Lewis, Monica Moya, D-Master 311, Britt the Alchemist, Taylor the Fox, Holly Howarth, Julia McWilliam, Lilypad, Serena and Jesse, Diego Rodriguez, OCL Perez, Wolfcat 128, Kamisha Coffin, Jen Scott, Avanza, Lucian Haran Allen, Hunter Nystrom, Tyson Harris, Ricky Monroe, Jess Gaming, Mastiff Nomad, James Lowe, Alabama Nana, Jessica Hunt, Kelly Savory, Chris Zamora, Dave, EL, Michelle Angel Wolf, Linda Allison, Indica Jane, and Kara Callie. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you get access to bonus videos and content, as well as a Discord channel. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow, and I'll see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.